Horrifying Skinwalker Navajo encounters. The last story is crazy. Number 1. The thing that wore my grandfather's face. I grew up on the Navajo reservation, where the land is vast, the skies stretch forever, and stories of things lurking in the shadows are more than just legends. My family, like many others, has always respected the old traditions, never whistling at night, never speaking of certain creatures aloud, and always listening when the elders warned us of danger. One story, however, has haunted my family for generations. It's about my grandfather, though if you ask the elders, they'll say it wasn't truly him who returned. When my grandfather was young, before he had a family of his own, he went missing in the desert. It was late autumn, and he had gone out to check on his family's sheep before a cold front moved in. He was supposed to be gone only an hour, but when the sun set and he hadn't returned, my great-grandfather gathered the men to search for him. They combed the land, calling his name, tracking his footprints through the dust. The footprints went deep into the canyons, weaving between rocks, stopping in strange places before continuing again. And then, suddenly they just stopped. No sign of a struggle, no indication of where he had gone. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air. For 3 days they searched. They found nothing. My great-grandmother, a medicine woman, warned that something unnatural had taken him. "If he returns," she whispered, "we must be certain it is him." On the third night, just as the elders had begun discussing funeral rites, my grandfather walked into the village, barefoot. His clothes were tattered, covered in dust. His skin was too pale, his hair matted with sweat and dirt. But the worst part was his eyes, wide and unfocused, like he had forgotten how to see. He did not speak, even as my great-grandfather ran to embrace him. He just stood there, breathing heavy, blinking slowly, as if adjusting to his own body. The family brought him inside, wrapped him in blankets, and tried to get him to eat, but he wouldn't touch the food. He sat still, staring into the fire. Occasionally, he would murmur words under his breath, but they were too garbled to understand. Then, sometime after midnight, my great-grandmother began to chant. She had been watching him closely all evening, her eyes full of suspicion. As the chanting grew louder, my grandfather, if that was really him, began to shake. His breath became ragged, his fingers clenching the blanket so tightly his knuckles turned white. And then, without warning, he screamed. It was not a normal scream. It was shrill, inhuman, like the sound of wind howling through dead trees. The entire family jolted awake as he convulsed on the floor. His body twisted, his limbs bent at unnatural angles, his mouth opened far too wide. My great-grandmother threw corn pollen at him and continued her prayers, her voice growing louder. And then, suddenly, it stopped. The thing wearing my grandfather's skin gasped, eyes rolling back, and collapsed. By morning, he was gone. The blankets were neatly folded. The spot where he had slept was cold. The door had been left slightly open, though no tracks led away from the house. My family searched for him again, but this time, no one truly expected to find him. A week later, my great-grandmother gathered the family and told us the truth. "That was not your grandfather," she said. "Something else took him, and something else brought him back." No one ever spoke of it again. My family never held a funeral, nor did they carve his name into the stone by our ancestors' resting place. It was as if he'd never existed. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind blows through the canyon, we hear his voice, calling our names, knocking on our doors, waiting to come back inside. If you're enjoying, please remember to like and subscribe for more. Number 2. The voice in the wind. My cousin David and I grew up hearing stories about the things that lived out in the desert. The elders always warned us, don't go too far from home at night, don't whistle in the dark, and if you ever hear someone calling your name from the trees, you run. You don't answer. You don't look. But when you're young, warnings feel like superstitions, just stories meant to scare kids into behaving. That's what I used to think, until the night David and I went camping near the Chuska Mountains. We were both in our early 20s, looking for one last adventure before he moved out of state for work. We packed light, just a couple of sleeping bags, some snacks, and a flashlight. No tent, no weapons. We planned to hike deep into the hills, set up camp near an old dry riverbed, and sleep under the stars. The hike was peaceful at first. The sun cast long shadows over the landscape, and the only sounds were the crunch of our boots and the occasional call of a coyote in the distance. By the time we found a good spot to settle down, the sun was already slipping below the horizon. The desert at night has a strange kind of silence, thick and heavy, like the land itself is holding its breath. We built a small fire and sat around it, talking about David's plans, about how different things would be once he moved. But then, in the middle of our conversation, we heard something. A voice, carried by the wind. At first, it was faint, barely more than a whisper, but it was enough to make us pause. We listened, thinking maybe it was another hiker or a distant animal call. But then we heard it again, clearer this time. It was saying my name. David and I exchanged looks. "Did you hear that?" I asked. He nodded slowly, his face pale in the firelight. "Yeah, it sounded like you." The wind picked up, rustling the dry brush around us. And then, in the space between the gusts, the voice came again. Closer now, almost playful. "Help me. I'm lost." But the voice wasn't right. It wasn't just that it sounded like me, it was the way it was said. Flat. Emotionless. Like someone was trying to imitate me but didn't quite understand how human voices worked. A chill ran down my spine. "Who's there?" I called out, against every warning the elders had ever given me. The desert answered with silence. David grabbed the flashlight and shone it toward the trees. At first, we saw nothing but shadows stretching long over the sand. But then, movement. A figure, standing just beyond the edge of the firelight. It looked like a man. Tall, too tall, with arms that hung just a little too low. The light hit its face, and my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a face at all. It was smooth, featureless except for a stretched, gaping mouth. Then, it opened its mouth wider, and my own voice came out. "Help me. I'm lost." David dropped the flashlight. "We need to go. Now." Neither of us hesitated. We grabbed what little we had and bolted, leaving the fire burning behind us. The wind howled as we ran, and with it came the sound of footsteps. Too many footsteps, coming from all around us. I didn't dare look back. I didn't need to. I could feel it watching. I could hear it whispering my name. We didn't stop running until we saw the headlights of my truck, parked just off the dirt road where we had started our hike. We jumped inside, locked the doors, and peeled out of there, dust kicking up behind us. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The only sound was our ragged breathing, the hum of the engine, and the wind still whistling outside. But just as we reached the main road, David let out a shaky breath. "You know what's weird?" he said. "It never called my name, only yours." I didn't have an answer for him. I still don't. But sometimes on quiet nights when the wind moves just right, I swear I still hear it, calling me, waiting for me to answer. Number 3. There were 3 of us camping that night, me, my cousin Eli, and our friend Daniel. We had driven out past the reservation, deep into the high desert where the land stretched endless and silent. This was Eli's idea. He always liked pushing boundaries, venturing into places we weren't supposed to go. "Just one night," he had said. "No one will even know we were here." I didn't like it. My grandmother had warned me about places like this. Places where the land didn't belong to us, where old things still walked at night. But I ignored my instincts and we went anyway. The day passed without anything strange happening. We set up camp in a clearing surrounded by piñon trees, built a fire, and cooked what little food we had brought. The stars came out bright and heavy in the sky, and for a while it was peaceful. Then he showed up. It started with a sound, footsteps, light and careful, moving just beyond the firelight. We all heard it. Daniel reached for the flashlight, but Eli, always reckless, just called out, "Who's there?" Silence. Then, after a moment, a man stepped into the light. At least I think it was a man. He was tall, too tall. His limbs were long and thin, his shoulders slightly hunched as if he wasn't used to standing upright. He wore old clothes, dusty and tattered, like something that had been left in the desert for too long. But it was his face that made my skin crawl. It was wrong. His features were stretched just a little too much, like skin pulled too tight over bone. His mouth was too wide, his eyes too dark, and he never blinked. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. His voice was strange, flat, emotionless, like someone imitating speech without understanding how it was supposed to sound. Eli, oblivious as always, just shrugged. "Sure, man, have a seat." Daniel and I shot each other a look, but we said nothing as the stranger sat down by the fire. He didn't move like a normal person. His motions were too fluid, too careful, as if he had studied how humans behaved but hadn't quite figured it out. For a while, he just watched us. Not the fire, not the food. United States. Eli, completely unfazed, kept talking about nothing. Some story about a girl he met in town. The stranger didn't respond. He only stared, his face expressionless, his hands folded neatly in his lap. Then after a long silence, he turned to me. "You," he said. "Your skin would fit me well." My stomach dropped. Eli laughed. "What the hell, dude?" The stranger didn't laugh. He didn't even smile. He just kept staring at me, those dark, empty eyes locked onto mine. My hands clenched into fists. Every instinct in my body screamed, "Run." Daniel cleared his throat. "It's getting late," he said carefully. "We should probably get some sleep." The stranger tilted his head. "Yes," he said. "Sleep." No one moved. For the first time, Eli seemed to sense something was off. He glanced between us and forced a laugh. Yeah, man. You should probably head back to your camp." The stranger didn't move. The fire crackled. The wind whispered through the trees. Then, with unnatural slowness, the stranger rose to his feet. His bones made a strange popping sound as he stretched, his limbs bending at odd angles. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back into the darkness. We listened until his footsteps faded. No one spoke. Then, suddenly, the fire dimmed, as if something had sucked the warmth from the air. I shivered. The night felt heavier now, the shadows deeper. "We're leaving," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. No one argued. We packed up in record time, throwing our gear into our bags without bothering to fold anything. The whole time I felt watched, like eyes were peering at us from the trees. As we climbed into the truck, Daniel turned on the headlights. That's when we saw him, standing just at the edge of the clearing, where the trees swallowed the light. Still, waiting. Then he smiled. Not a normal smile. Too wide, too stretched, as if his skin didn't quite fit his face. Eli slammed the gas, and we sped down the dirt road, the truck bouncing over the uneven ground. No one looked back. When we finally made it home, my grandmother was waiting for me on the porch. She took one look at me, at the fear still lingering in my eyes, and nodded. "You saw it, didn't you?" she asked softly. I swallowed hard. What was it? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into her pocket, pulled out a small pouch of corn pollen, and pressed it into my hand. "Next time," she said, "don't let it sit by your fire." We never spoke about that night again, and I never went camping on that land again. But sometimes, late at night, I dream of that fire, and the thing that smiled at me from the dark. Thanks for watching till the end. Please like and subscribe for more videos. Number 1. The long shadow driving alone at night is something I've always hated. It's not the dark that bothers me. It's the quiet. The way the world feels too still, too empty, like you're the last person left awake. I was on my way home from visiting my cousin, taking a long stretch of desert highway that cut through reservation land. No streetlights, no houses, just miles of dirt and shrubs under a sky full of stars. My headlights barely reached the edges of the road, and my radio had lost signal miles ago. The only sound was my engine and the occasional bump of the cracked pavement beneath my tires. That's when I saw him. A man, walking along the side of the road. I barely noticed him at first, just a shadow in my peripheral. He was tall, wearing some kind of long, dark coat that blended into the night. I should have just kept driving, but something about him unsettled me. Maybe it was the way he walked, slow, deliberate, like he wasn't in a hurry to get anywhere. Then I saw his shadow. It stretched across the road, unnaturally long, reaching far beyond the glow of my headlights. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but as I got closer, I realized the shadow didn't match him at all. It was moving differently, flowing almost, like ink spreading across the pavement. A chill crawled up my spine. I sped up, keeping my eyes on the road, pretending I hadn't noticed. But as I passed him, something in my gut told me to look. I wish I hadn't. His face wasn't right. His skin looked stretched, pulled too tight over his skull, his mouth slightly open, as if frozen mid-speech. But it was his eyes that got me. Completely black, reflecting nothing, like two empty holes in his face. And he was staring at me. I pressed harder on the gas. The road stretched out endlessly ahead of me, my heart pounding in my chest. I kept telling myself it was just some guy, some traveler who looked strange in the headlights. But that shadow, that impossibly long, shifting shadow, I couldn't explain that. Then my headlights flickered, just for a second, a brief sputter of darkness. And when they came back on, he was standing in the middle of the road. I slammed the brakes. The car skidded, tires screeching, and my headlights landed directly on him. But now, something was different. His shadow was gone. He just stood there, staring, head slightly tilted, arms hanging at his sides like a puppet with its strings cut. My breathing was ragged, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. I didn't wait. I swerved around him, nearly losing control, and floored it down the highway. I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see him still standing there. But he was gone. Relief started to settle in, until I noticed something. My own shadow. The headlights cast it onto the road ahead of me. But as I drove, it started to change. Stretching. Growing. It twisted unnaturally, pulling away from me, moving against the light, and then, for the briefest moment, it turned its head and looked at me. I don't remember much after that. I must have driven the rest of the way in blind panic, because the next thing I knew, I was pulling into my driveway, lungs burning, hands shaking. I ran inside, locked every door, closed every curtain. But even now, I don't feel safe. Because every night since then, whenever I'm alone, I see it. My shadow, stretching just a little too far, waiting, watching. And sometimes, it moves when I don't. If you're enjoying so far, please like and subscribe for more. Number 2. The knock at the window. There are certain rules you follow when you grow up near the reservation. Never whistle at night. Never look into the trees for too long. and never, under any circumstances, open the window after dark. I never questioned it much as a kid. It was just something my grandmother always told me. If I asked why, she'd just shake her head and say, "Things listen when you make noise at night." I live in a small house, miles away from the nearest neighbor. It's quiet out here, nothing but desert and the occasional coyote passing through. Peaceful during the day, different at night. The knocking started a few weeks ago. At first it was faint, a single tap at my bedroom window around midnight. I ignored it, figuring it was just the wind or a stray branch. But then it happened again. 3 knocks. Slow, deliberate. I sat up in bed, listening. And there was no wind that night, no trees close enough to touch the glass. My stomach tightened. The nearest house was over 5 miles away. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just waited. After a long silence, I finally convinced myself I was imagining things and forced myself to lie back down. But just as I was about to drift off, knock, knock, knock. I bolted upright, heart pounding. It was louder this time, closer. I reached for my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it at the window. Nothing. Just my own reflection staring back at me. The desert beyond was pitch black. I told myself it was nothing and went back to sleep. The next morning I checked outside. No footprints, no signs of anything near the window. Just endless, undisturbed sand. The second night, it happened again. 3 knocks. Identical to before. I didn't move, didn't even turn on my light this time. I just listened. The sound sent a chill down my spine, like something waiting, testing me. I pulled the blanket over my head and waited until morning. The third night, something changed. I woke up to silence. No knocking. No sound at all. Relieved, I rolled over and checked my phone. 3:12 a.m. Then, from directly outside my window, "Let me in." It was my mother's voice. But my mother wasn't there. She lived in town, miles away, and she sure as hell wasn't outside my window in the middle of the night. I gripped the blanket so hard my knuckles ached. The voice came again, softer this time. "Let me in. It's cold out here." A sickening realization hit me. It wasn't just my mother's voice, it was almost her voice. The words were too slow, too careful, like something imitating her but not quite getting it right. I squeezed my eyes shut. Then, knock, knock, knock. I stopped breathing. The voice came again, closer this time, pressing against the glass. "Why won't you let me in?" I wanted to scream, but my throat locked up. I just lay there, motionless, heart hammering against my ribs. I don't know how long it lasted. Minutes? Hours? I kept my eyes shut, my body frozen. At some point, the knocking stopped, but I didn't sleep. The next morning, I found handprints on the glass. Too large for my mother's hands, and too many fingers. That was 2 weeks ago. I don't sleep much anymore. I keep my curtains shut, my doors locked. I started keeping a knife under my pillow. Not that I think it would help. Because last night, something changed again. The knocking didn't come from my window this time. It came from my closet. And this time it whispered my name. They're number 3. The Bone Collector. I live alone. It's something I used to enjoy. The quiet, the freedom. My house is small, sitting on the edge of the desert, just outside the reservation. It's peaceful during the day, the kind of place where you can hear the wind whisper through the dry grass. But lately I don't feel alone. It started with the bones. I found the first one a month ago. A small, sun-bleached vertebra sitting on my doorstep like an offering. At first I thought it was just an animal dragging it there, maybe a coyote or a stray dog. I kicked it into the dirt and went about my day. But the next morning, there were two bones, a rib and a femur, placed neatly side by side on the porch. That time I hesitated. The arrangement felt intentional, like someone wanted me to notice. I checked my security cameras, but the footage showed nothing. Just the empty porch, the shifting shadows of the desert. I should have left then. The next day I found a skull, small, animal-like. Maybe a rabbit, maybe something else. But it wasn't just placed on my porch, it was positioned, sitting upright, facing my front door, watching. That night I locked every door, shut every window. I told myself it was just some animal, some weird coincidence. But deep down, I knew better. The knocking started a few days later. It came just after midnight. A single light tap on the window beside my bed. I froze. The sound was too deliberate, too careful, like fingers against the glass. My bedroom window faced the backyard, where nothing but open desert stretched for miles. I didn't move. Another tap, then silence. I lay there barely breathing, listening to the wind howl outside. When I finally found the courage to sit up and check, there was nothing there. Just my own reflection staring back at me. But in the morning, more bones. They were arranged in a pattern now. Circles, spirals, something almost like symbols. They stretched from my porch to my yard, leading toward my bedroom window. That was when I knew. I wasn't dealing with an animal. Something was watching me. I thought about leaving, packing up and staying with a friend. But fear does strange things. It convinces you to stay put, tells you it's just your imagination. That night I locked my doors again, placed a chair under the doorknob, and left every light in the house on. At exactly 12:03 a.m., the knocking came again. This time, it wasn't at the window. It was at the back door, software rhythmic, patient. I gripped the blanket, my body rigid. My mind screamed at me to check the cameras, to call someone, but I didn't move. Then, slowly, the door handle turned. Not shaking, not forced, just a slow, deliberate turn, testing the lock. I clamped a hand over my mouth, heart slamming against my ribs. The door didn't open. It couldn't. But something was out there. Something that wasn't an animal. Something that knew exactly what it was doing. The handle twisted again. Then, after a long pause, a whisper. "I know you can hear me." My stomach turned to ice. The voice was wrong, too thin, too stretched, like someone trying to mimic human speech but failing. I stayed frozen until the first light of dawn. Only then did I check the cameras. Nothing, no movement, no figure. But when I stepped outside, I saw them. More bones. Hundreds of them, laid carefully in a spiral around my house. I left that day, drove straight to my cousin's place and refused to go back. I don't know what it was. I don't want to know. But sometimes, at night, I wake up to a sound in the distance. A single, soft knock. And I know. It's still looking for me. Thanks for watching. Remember to like and subscribe for more videos.